I have the pleasure today of speaking to an author that I've really come to respect and appreciate, and someone who has created a series that I've read first time last year and have just enjoyed more and more with each consecutive book. Dan Stout, author of the Carter Archives, starting with book 1, Titanshade, and the 2 sequels, Titan's Day and Titan Song. Dan, thank you for joining me. Welcome. How are you?
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Just over the past year, when I first got introduced to your work, and I think I came across it in an article for IO9, where they do sort of like monthly releases. And the first thing that grabbed me was the cover of Titan's Day, those Chris McGrath covers. And just immediately I got a sense of a 70s, 80s noir vibe, and that's right up my alley. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so lucky to have those covers. You know, so much of the cover process is outside of the writer's hands. And I'm really lucky that Daw is both open to suggestions and willing to take the time and the effort to bring in such talented artists, and then to put through the design work, because all that distress, like the things that look like rips and tears and wearing on the cover, is right in line with the story. And it's just gorgeous and fantastic. I love it every time.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those few series where I look at the covers after I'd read the books, and I go back and I think, holy crap, this is just sort of atmospherically, thematically, the way that they designed the characters and everything like that is so spot on.
Yeah.
And I mean, as a new author, I can imagine that was just such a relief, but also immensely pleasurable to just see that come to fruition.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, when they went ahead with the cover, I kind of pitched them on the cover idea, and I suggested Chris as the artist, and it was absolutely no question about it, no pushback. Daw said, great, let's do it. And within 24 hours, I was on an email chain, kicking ideas back and forth and talking about the design. And Adrian, it was nerd heaven. It was like the best, most fun thing I've ever done. It was great.
I mean, that's amazing, because I go back and now I start to notice his covers everywhere, and I realized he's done the covers for Jim Butcher's Dresden Files. And those covers are very emblematic of what that series is about. And it's obviously a very different vibe from you, but at the same time, they're both sort of straddling this fantasy noir element, and Chris just nailed it perfectly with his series and with your series as well.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to quickly ask you how you're doing. How's life? How are you handling the last year, the pandemic and everything like that?
You know, I'm doing as well as can be expected. It's one of those things where I was really lucky in that I already worked from home when the pandemic came along, and we were able to kind of hole up. And you know, I live with my fiance, so I wasn't completely isolated, and we were always there to take care of each other and take care of our families. And we were very lucky in that we had very little direct impact from COVID and the pandemic. We both had people in our circles who were hospitalized and who suffered, and it's just a reminder of how random things like that can be.
Yeah.
So we've just sort of kept our heads down, kept working, and we're eager to be coming out the other side now.
Oh man, that's great. I'm really glad to hear that. And I mean, it sounds like you took the right approach. Obviously, whatever's happening around, you buckle down, stay active, keep your mind moving. And obviously, I imagine you've been busy writing for most of the pandemic, probably on Titan Song. No?
Yeah. That's mostly what I've been doing during the lockdown. Correct.
Yeah. And how was that experience for you, kind of going into the third book of a series, but also given the circumstances around, how did all of that kind of come together in your experience of writing the third book?
The third book was really me putting into practice everything that I had learned from doing the second book, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I really had to learn that writing a sequel is a different skill set than writing the first novel in a series or a standalone novel. They're obviously related, but it's an entirely different set of expectations, both in terms of timeline and story structure, frankly, so that the audience knows what to expect. And I love writing these books, and I love diving into the story. And it was fun to go into a novel where I had learned how to write a sequel that way and really be able to flex my muscles and, narratively speaking, and move through it much quicker, which let me put more and more polish with each consecutive draft. So it was a lot of fun. And, in terms of working through the pandemic, it was also a real escape for me, because it let me just hole up in my room, turn off the internet, turn off the news, and focus on playing in this fantasy world and telling a great story.
Yeah, I mean, you had the opportunity to kind of step aside and enter your own alternate reality of sorts with characters that you've created, but also over the course of 3 books, you've had the opportunity to really inhabit their minds and their motivations and their personalities.
Yeah, it's really fun sliding back into those waters and feeling right at home right from the get-go.
Yeah, and speaking of which, when it comes to the creation of the series, really what keeps it all together for me as a reader, and I'm curious about your perspective of this, is Detective Carter, who's the protagonist of all three books in the Carter archives. How was it that you sort of created him and his personality, and how do you feel about him all these years later after having basically entered his mind and created his life from scratch over the course of 3 books?
Yeah, there was a website called Liberty Hall, and it was a weekly flash fiction challenge, and it was a great way for both new and established writers to really kind of hone their skills and kind of do rapid prototyping. Basically, the way it worked was on Friday evening, they posted a link and you could click on it. And when you did that, it started a 90-minute timer. And you had 90 minutes to write a story and post it to the site. It would be anonymous. And everybody else who took part in it could read it and critique it, give you comments, and move on to the next thing. And what was beautiful about it was that 90-minute limit meant that there was no expectation that it would be good. So you didn't have to worry about trying to write the perfect story. You just had to write a story that was compelling and interesting as you could make it. Just
let your ideas explode, and then be comforted by the fact that there's probably some judgment, but there's very little judgment.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody else who's in it is going through exactly the same thing. So it's really hard to be judgmental about somebody else's story when I know what a mess the thing that I posted is. And everybody on that community was really great and supportive and encouraging. And I sat down. Honestly, I don't even remember what the prompt was that week, but I got the first, just over the first half of the first chapter for book 1 written in 90 minutes. And I had Carter and the setting and the concept of mana and the murder and the Molenkampi. And just judging from the feedback that I got and how much fun I had writing it, I knew that I had something I wanted to work with.
Yeah.
So it was kind of up and running from there. And to the second half of the question, one of the things that really makes Carter engaging for me, like you said, years later, is that he's a little bit unreliable in one aspect, in that he presents himself as a cynic. So he presents himself as kind of like a bitter person who has this dark view of the world, but that's actually not true. He's not a cynic. He's a disillusioned idealist. And that sounds like a small difference, but it actually makes a huge, huge distinction when you're inhabiting that mindset. Because
Carter, from a reader's perspective as well, it's the difference between his spoken dialogue and his internal monologue is very clear. That he has a bit of personality complex in the sense that he presents himself differently than he views himself. And so it's difficult for him to be outwardly honest as he is inside, in his heart and in his soul.
Absolutely. Yes, that's exactly what I'm aiming for. And that's one of the things that prose novels are so brilliant at, is they really let you see that interiority and see the conflict between what someone's saying and feeling, and all those different layers going on at once. It's a little bit like music that way, and that there's these different tracks and voices all kind of harmonizing.
No, I mean, that's amazing. And it really adds a level of honesty to the story, because Detective Carter is a genuine person. And obviously you're pulling a lot from noir tropes, from the detective genre. The cynical detective is very common within that genre. And it's, I think it's a good progression to have this complex character who presents himself in this sort of typical way of what we imagine a detective or a police officer, who's a bit jaded and has spent too much time on the streets and seen too much negativity and all that. But internally, they're much more, I would even call him a bit of a softie on the inside, you know, because he cares about the people around him. He cares about the city that he's serving. And it creates this nice dynamic between what he feels inside and what the outward personality, as determined by the city or the job or the people that he comes across, how that plays out. And I really enjoy that dynamic.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
No. And the way that he interacts with the other characters as well, you start to understand. And I want to get your perspective on this in terms of character motivations and character development, how Detective Carter, his progression as an individual is reflected by the way he interacts with the people around him and the relationships that he develops. So for you, when it comes to characters like Ajax, who's Detective Carter's partner throughout the series, but also other characters, family like Tanya, or co-workers like Dio Geyer, who I really love in particular. She's a badass. Or just the multitude of characters that he comes across. For you, what is it that is most important when creating these character interactions, and how these characters progress and develop over the course of each novel?
Well, man, I hope this isn't too general of an answer, but it's honesty, right? Yeah. Like once I get a character and I have a good feeling for them, the most important thing is that they're behaving in a way that's honest to that core. And that doesn't mean consistent, because people aren't consistent. I'm not always consistent. No. I wish I was more consistent, but I'm not, you know? And so finding somebody who is honest and true, and that's how you have somebody who feels like a real person. And I think everybody who writes gets into these situations where you know what you want these characters to do in a given scene, but as you're working on it, it doesn't feel true. It doesn't feel honest. And then when you figure it out, it's almost always that you have them behaving in a way that isn't quite right. And once you fix that, everything else falls into place. Yeah,
100%. And for you, just kind of looking at the past works that you've done, you know, for instance, when you're writing Titan's Day and you're looking at Titanshade, how do you sort of compartmentalize all of the things that happen to a particular character, and how the book that you're currently working on, how you want their motivations to play out? Do you sort of plan out, this is more or less what I want to happen between Detective Carter and this particular character? Or
are you talking about over the course of multiple books, or in a given book?
In a given book, or in the series as a whole?
Yeah, and in a given book, I really let them kind of explore it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that doesn't sound too pompous. Like I'm like they're
No, I mean, it's
people.
more or less like this particular aspect of the writing process is you pantsing.
Yeah,
You know?
that's exactly it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just letting them kind of explore it on their own, and I'm reacting to it.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about how things are going to pan out over multiple books, I have an idea of it, and I know roughly what I would like to see happen.
Yeah.
But the actual details of getting from A to B are much more organic and fluid.
Yeah.
And you know, I change my mind too sometimes when I'm going along and all of a sudden the characters veer off in a direction that is just, it's better than I would have come up with if I had just been sitting there brainstorming.
Yeah.
So
but that's the beauty of it though, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know? It's kind of like the magical touch that a creative art or project or job or profession brings. Like that's what you look for, those little sparks, those little moments that tell you, oh crap, that was unexpected. But I love it.
Yeah. Well, and there's a distinction between the writing of the book and the reading of the book in that I get, as the author, I get to own everything that was wrong and didn't make it into the book.
Yeah.
So I have all these conversations with the characters that go down blind alleys and just don't work, and they just don't feel right. And those are really cool too in their own way. They're like sketches for a sculpture that don't look quite right, and they didn't make it all the way to the finished product.
Yeah.
But they're still kind of beautiful and fun, and I got to experience them along the way.
And those are the things that exist in your mind as sort of this this backup of a project as a whole, but you are the sole person who has this little memory bank of all of the, I wouldn't even call them failed experiments, but you know, experiments that didn't quite nail exactly what you were going for. But at the same time, I imagine for you, tell me if I'm wrong, that those failed experiments inform what ends up in the final book.
Yeah, absolutely. They absolutely do. Not in a way that like, you know, I mean, obviously it's not in a way that it wouldn't make sense without knowing them. It has to be in a way that it informs it for me personally as the guy who's doing it. But yeah, you're absolutely nailing it. That's all part of the magic of writing the book. And when somebody is the artist and they're making the thing, the path that they took to make the thing is always the path they took. It's always right for them. And then the person who reads the book, whether it's you or somebody else, and they may love the book, they may hate the book, but it's their reading of the book, that's always theirs. And I am never allowed to tell them they're reading it wrong. Yeah. Because that's their aspect of the creative project that they're bringing to it. That's what makes it a collaboration.
Exactly. That's the beautiful symbiosis of any art form, is that there's the creator and the reader or the viewer or whoever is experiencing that particular art form, is they get the joy of knowing that the way that they react to it is theirs and theirs alone, but that is in relation to whoever created it and the way that they felt in the process of putting that thing into the world. Yeah,
that's why I dedicated Titan Song to the reader, because that person is picking it up, and we're, you know, hundreds or thousands of miles away, maybe years apart, but we're like two musicians jamming on a song. We're working and we're playing this thing together, and it's, oh man, it like gives me the chills thinking about it. It is amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Oh man, yeah, and I mean, for you, obviously, as a writer now, what do you think about how things were in the past for you, going from the role of the reader and now to the writer, and what was it like for you back then when you were reading something particularly magical, and how does that sort of contribute to what you're doing now?
That is such a great question. I feel like that's the kind of thing I could sit around and think on for a while. But to give a quick answer, that there's this feeling you get sometimes when you're reading, or you're just engaged in really, really deeply with some piece of art, and it just moves you to your core. and maybe it's joy or maybe it's sorrow, whatever. It's just that moment transcends everything else that you're doing. It just becomes all encompassing, and trying to find little moments where I can strive to hit that with different readers is always my goal. Nobody's going to read a 400-page book and have that moment all the way through.
Yeah.
But some people are going to have it, and some people are going to have it at different points. So to give as many opportunities for that magic to happen as I can, that's absolutely what I'm aiming for.
Yeah. And I think it's really good that you're consciously thinking about, obviously nobody, like you say, is going to look at every single page, read it and think, holy crap, this is life-changing. It's kind of like a book is meaningful in terms of the conglomeration of small moments that build up into something that really moves you. And I think for me, when I'm reading these books, there are so many small details. I feel like you're a very detail-oriented person, because there's a lot of minute details that to me add a lot of credibility and a lot of sort of just genuine humanness to the series, whether it's something small like Detective Carter remembering, oh shit, I need to feed my cat, or he neglects to feed himself. And you think like, oh man, those are those kinds of moments where you get so wrapped up in something that you can forget about these little habitual things that are actually very important. A cat needs to eat, a human being needs to eat. But then it also extends to the small details that you put into, for instance, the police work. And this is very much a series of police procedurals, but I think it's the details that come up in the smallest moments, whether it's, yes, a police officer is a police officer. And in the movies, we see the big action scenes, the chase, the handcuffs, the reading of the Miranda rights and all that kind of stuff. But you're very much focused on all aspects of the reality of being a police officer, being a detective, whether it's from the paperwork and the more mundane stuff to the chase scenes and the action. So for you, how did you go about sort of researching all these little details and adding as much into it that you felt would give it that genuine touch?
Yeah, there was a few different things. Partly is kind of embracing, as a fantasy noir blend, I knew that I was going to have some readers coming in who had really only read mysteries before. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to really lean into some of those noir tropes and then flip them a little bit. But I throw a bunch of weird stuff at the reader pretty much from page one, Yeah. So for mandibles is very much a weird thing to start off. Oh yeah. It's right from the get-go. So I'm asking non-fantasy readers to really bear with me. So I had to give them something that they recognized and they could use as a handrail as we're sort of climbing the spiral staircase of insanity and building to a climax. So for that first book, I really leaned into those kind of familiar images and sounds. And then for books 2 and 3, I had kind of covered my own personal experience with just from talking to police officers and, firsthand experience with things. So I enrolled in a citizens police academy. The local city had it. You go down to the police academy and you go through the whole training. So, I mean, you go on that big fake gun range with the big video and you shoot things and you get tased and you experience all this sort of stuff. So you get firsthand experiences, you get a chance to go on a ride along. And so you have all these things, but the really killer details are, it's not going in the ride along with the siren blaring, and that's interesting, but it's filling out the paperwork after you've arrested somebody and you're just standing there and they're playing smooth jazz in the background and all those kind of weird incongruities that it's all part of that life. And so I try to really pull on small concrete details to find the capital T truth instead of just the little detail. And I'm rambling. I'm sorry, Ben.
No, I mean, it's perfect. I mean, this is exactly what I wanted to ask you about, is just you really nailed that aspect of blending the action and the more exciting details about being a police officer, being a detective. But because you're also in this fantasy world, you did a great job of melding the mundane aspects of police work, or just general life, not necessarily just being a police officer, but being an off-duty police officer, for instance, in with the world building and the history that you created in Titanshade and the world around it. And I think that is one of the key aspects, on top of a great character, is having this world and these small details that kind of pull you in and think, that sounds familiar, but it's just a little bit off. And that clicks something in the head where you think, oh man, I want to know more. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah. I always recommend people check out Tim O'Brien's book, The Things They Carried, which it's a book about his experience in the Vietnam War, but it's also a book about storytelling. And he spends a lot of time talking about the idea of explaining how boring it could be to be in the Army during a war. And that's punctuated by these moments of complete confusion and terror. And it's that question of, how do you describe a boring scenario without boring the reader? And part of his answer was that you can't actually literally take someone through sitting around doing nothing for hours. So you have to find something that represents and symbolizes that as many people as possible will latch onto. And in their head, they're going to flip that little switch, like you're talking about, and say, oh, this is really boring.
Yeah.
And get there. It's a really delicate balance.
But the thing is it doesn't linger necessarily. Obviously, there are ways of representing these more boring in between lulls, but the key is not to linger for too long. It's like you want to give just the right amount of detail in order for that setting and that instance to make sense, but not necessarily to go too long to the point where they're thinking, oh, fuck, just get on to the next chapter or anything along those lines, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's cooking, it's, you need pepper and you need lemon juice, and you need all this stuff. But if you put in a cup of lemon juice, it's going to be inedible. So you need just enough, and you need to balance all the flavors. And you need to understand that sometimes the answer isn't to put more of a certain spice in. The answer is to put a little bit different spice, and that brings out the flavor.
Exactly.
That was one of the things that my editor, Sheila Gilbert, really taught me. She is a brilliant editor. And we were having a conversation about a couple of the relationships in the book. And without getting into spoilers, there's a couple like parent-child relationships that are explored. And one of the ways that you can, I had one of those relationships that I was trying to kind of dig into and do more with. And she suggested that instead of spending more time on that one, I spend a little bit more time on one that contrasts with it. And so instead of eating up another chapter of these people standing around and talking, I just show these other people having a bad relationship. And all of a sudden, this one just snapped into focus. And it was incredible. It absolutely floored me. And I love learning stuff like that. And I love working with really talented, knowledgeable people like that.
Yeah. And I mean, for you, I imagine it's one thing to sort of be just a singular person with a creative vision and typing it all out, doing the outline, doing the first draft, revision, and all that kind of stuff. But what I've learned more and more about the publishing industry is that a book is a conglomeration and a mix of so many different people putting their talents toward a project that they believe in. Obviously, the author, you are the face of the project, but so many other people, whether it's editors, whether it's a cover designer or cover artist or the marketing department, et cetera, these people put a lot of effort into making sure that your project is the best possible version of itself that it can be, And for you, how has it been going from book 1 to book 3, now being a published author, how has that more professional side of things been for you?
It is really, really amazing. And publishing is a weird and wonderful industry to be in. And it can be frustrating, and I love it. I'm really lucky. I mentioned DAW before, like the way they work with me on the cover.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody involved in that company is just incredible. And it's just a constant reminder that the people who are in publishing, I'm sure there are some people who don't like books in publishing, but
I can't imagine who. Like, why would you get into that?
I don't think there's very many. And that doesn't mean that things are always going to go your way, but man, the vast majority of people want you to succeed and they want to help. And sometimes things are going to happen that are out of everyone's control. The pandemic is a great example.
Mm-hmm.
We had all kinds of promotion things planned and appearances and stuff like that. And then because book 2 came out in March of 2020, so everything was canceled and not everything was able to get picked back up and replaced. And it's because it wasn't just my stuff getting canceled, it was everybody getting canceled. And, we were all just trying to figure out what was going to happen and trying to help the bookstores stay open and keep things moving, and figuring it out the best we could. But
Mm-hmm.
I've been so impressed with everybody along the way, from my agent, Nat Sobel, to Sheila Gilbert, to everybody at Dawn along the way. I'm extremely lucky. I've never really run across some of the bad apples in the industry. So
I think bad apples tend to attract bad apples. So if you put yourself out there as an author who is willing to collaborate, is willing to accept positive critique and put that towards something that in the end is going to be a better book, I think everyone around sort of realizes that. And usually bad apples tend to get pushed aside if the general group realizes this person is a negative influence and we have to do something about that. Yeah. And just from talking to you for this short while, I can already see that you are a very nice guy and you're very positive, and the people that you come across in the publishing industry for sure have noticed that and project that back upon you.
yeah, I mean, I think you have to advocate for yourself, and you have to stand up and say, oh, hey, this, if something isn't working, you got to tell people it's not working.
Exactly.
But if you're saying thank you along the way and letting people know that you appreciate all the hard work that they're doing, like I said, people in publishing, they love books, they love authors, and they love readers. So
exactly. Yeah. And how's the whole marketing and release of Titan Song gone in comparison to book 2? Because I mean, now you've released 2 books within the pandemic. So
well, things got back a little bit more to normal in terms of the split of sales between ebooks and hardcovers.
Mm-hmm.
The second book, Titan's Day, came out and it went out to a bunch of stores, and the stores never opened, and they had this massive backlog of books. So there were a lot of places where people just never saw the book in a store.
Yep.
And things like my mom never got a chance to go out and buy it in a physical store like she wanted to. But honestly, Adrian, I didn't want her to go to a physical store. It was like,
no, of course not. It's like, don't risk yourself just to buy my book, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I will give you a book, Mom. It's totally cool. I've got you covered. But so it's that kind of thing. So the physical sales on book 2 were way down, but then that kind of ratio bounced right back for book 3.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a matter of trying to get the word out, make up for that lost year. And it's certainly tough. I don't want to make it sound like it's easy, but we're all doing the best we can, and just going out there and spreading the word, and letting people know that I appreciate them reading and having a good time with it.
Yeah, and I think that shows. I mean, you're quite active on Twitter in the sense that you're responsive to the people that reach out to you. Before we even did this chat, before I even started writing for FanFiAddict, I had just tweeted about your books and saying that I really like them and everything like that. And you tweeted back to me and said, thank you, and that to me is, it means a lot. It's just a little small token of gratitude that goes a long way for me to know that I really like this book and the author said thank you when I said that his book was good.
Well, I mean, it goes back to what we were saying before about it. It's a collaboration, and that story that's in your head when you read these books is unique to you.
Mm-hmm.
And you're the co-author. Like, we did that together.
Yep.
And that's true for every single person who likes it or hates it. I genuinely don't mind when people don't like the books too, because they still read it. They still went on that adventure. And
exactly.
It's kind of incredible. I prefer that they like it, but
it's give and take. You can't have everything.
Yeah.
But
if you and I sat here and talk about our favorite books, sooner or later we're going to have something where we just disagree and we think the other person is just crazy for liking this book.
Yeah.
And why would my stuff be any different? So.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, for you have kind of this mix of genres
Mm-hmm.
where you're bringing in noir and detective and mystery elements into a fantasy world. And I imagine, like you said earlier, you had to do some legwork in order to establish this in some sort of familiarity and then draw in all of these different strange elements, and how was it for you in terms of creating those strange elements to begin with and then implementing them into a story that felt realistic and grounded, but at the same time is seeped in all kinds of oddities?
Yeah, I think the strange just kind of comes naturally, if I'm being honest. I really love weird things and fantasy and monsters and magic. And I found out, I was talking about Liberty Hall, that idea of like writing a story a week.
Mm-hmm.
If you do that for a year or two, you end up with this huge backlog of stories and you find out what you enjoy writing about. And I love writing about noir and mystery and kind of twisty plots. So when I hit those things together in a way that I found really resonating with me, I was able to just run with it and get as weird as I liked. And it was very easy for me to always kind of ground it back to something familiar and something physical and tangible.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it is those small details, right? Because if somebody is casting a spell and there's all kinds of weird stuff going on, we don't really know what that's like.
Yeah.
But if they're casting a spell and they have to worry about whether or not they're going to run out of gas on the way to work, that is something we can relate to. So you sort of weave the realistic with the fantastical.
Mm-hmm. And specifically when it comes to your magic system, I also want to touch on the races that you've created. The magic system, the first time I read Titanshade, immediately what came to mind was, I don't know if you played the Dishonored video game series.
Mm-hmm.
It's
I need to check those out. I
yes.
keep hearing about them.
It's because but this is the beautiful thing about creativity and how the mind works, is we extrapolate all these details on an individual level, but the way that it commingles and then forms into something that is a reflection of us is unique, but at the same time you can see parallels in other aspects of the world and other projects. And the Dishonored series, they have magic that is taken from the bellies of whales. And immediately when I read your book, I was like, holy crap, that's so cool. Because that was the second time that I've seen that. But the way that you take your magic system and sort of ground it in the reality of this almost oil-like substance that is precious and limited in quantity, I thought was a really smart idea, because it creates this sort of backdrop for the world, in the sense that there was an oil boom or a mana boom, and then that died out. And so there's an industry that built up and then kind of dissolved under the weight of its own greed, essentially. And I wanted to ask you how the mana and the magic system kind of came about, but how you use that to sort of create parallels between the world and Titanshade as a city?
Well, I was really interested in kind of exploring the concept of magic as a limited resource. And one of the brilliant things about fantasy is that it lets you talk about things like fossil fuels, number one, without becoming patronizing or didactic, right?
Yeah.
So, but the other thing is, I don't have any answers about fossil fuels and renewable resources. Like I'm just some dude sitting in Ohio, you know, I don't have any answers, but I can present things in a way that makes the reader maybe ask some questions, and they can take that and they can go on to something that's a lot more creative and clever than I am. So if I pull these real world elements and sort of swirl them around in the pot, I can talk about things that I find interesting without having to weigh down the discussion with overly mundane details or getting overly preachy. And it lets us talk about stuff while still having a lot of fun.
Yeah. And especially in the sense that you do a little bit of world building and history through what's happened to the supply of mana in this world. And then you bring that into the current reality and how that sort of plays out on a socioeconomic level, a political level, and on an individual level as well.
Yeah, well, and it tells you a lot about the world right away, right? Because, all right, here's this world with magic, and it's in Wales, so they hunted them to extinction. And that tells you a lot about what you need to know for that's going on in that society globally.
Yep.
And that it's probably not too far from what we would do.
Exactly. And so when you created the other races, how were you thinking about, in relation to the world as a whole, what you just explained is sort of this reflection of human nature and how we just go balls to the walls and extract every possible milliliter of this resource that we can. But then it's not just humans, there are other races at play as well. So how did you create them, and how did you sort of create the cultural complexities and the sort of natural tendencies of those races?
It's a little bit of a combination of a few different things. Sort of the Molenkampi, like these creatures that have the mandibles and two mouths and all that sort of stuff. I came up with just the cool image and I liked it. And then the more I explored it, the more I liked it. And I liked the idea of interweaving disparate characters together. And I really enjoy juxtaposing contrasting elements. So the two kind of buddy cops in the story are Detectives Carter and Ajax. And it's that kind of classic slobby veteran and the clean-cut kid. But the clean-cut kid also has, you know, a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth and head plates and giant mandibles and a mouth like a blender, you know. So, and the whole idea that the Molenkampi have these terrifying mouths that look like they're, you know, a creature exploding out from them. And they have beautiful voices, and they naturally harmonize and can do all this kind of thing, and they have such a tonal language. That's really interesting to me too. So I tend to be drawn to finding a way that I find the expectation that the reader has, and then I try to contrast it by bringing something else right alongside it that makes it feel like just a little bit different. It goes back to what you said earlier about reading something in a detail. And it's like, oh, that sounds familiar, but it's different. And that makes you want to know more.
Yeah. Just these little contrasts that add an extra level to it. And, you know, you have a lot of contrast between the different races too, in terms of the environments that they're naturally bred in. You know, the Gilman, for instance, are more amphibian-like. And then you have I think it's the Barakusu is how you say it. But they're almost like nomadic herd animals, but in this strange religious, almost shamanic role within the world, because they're the elder race essentially. So I found these contrasts to be very interesting in terms of the perspectives that people have towards the world as a whole, and then how that's reflected in the races themselves.
Yeah, and it's everything you're talking about is absolutely true. And then on top of that, just as the author, you put in these little Easter eggs to amuse yourself. So some of the details that are kind of cool are just there because they're me poking fun at myself. Mm-hmm. The Molenkampi, all the males, their names begin with A. And that's because whenever I write my drafts, and I don't know why I do this, but I give everybody a name that starts with the same letter. And I'll notice it and I'll realize that I have like Sam and Steve and Sarah, and I'll go back in and I'll try to fix it, and I'll end up with like Fred and Frank and Francis. And I have no idea why I do this, but I just thought,
you're just a fan of alliteration.
I guess that's what it is, but it makes it really confusing to keep everything straight, So I just thought I was making the Molenkampi. I needed to come up with a second Molenkampi name after I introduced the first character. Mm-hmm. And I thought, you know what, the hell with it. They all have an A names, all of them.
And I have to ask, is when you came up with Molenkampi, is it just a play on John Cougar Mellencamp? Where did because that's what I think of every time I read that name, is I think of John Cougar Mellencamp.
That is brilliant. I love it. That is great. It is now for sure. Perfect.
It's canon. It's canon.
Yeah. There's a type of bug that has really big mandibles, and it's not named a Molenkampi, but it's a Molen something.
Yeah.
So when I was kind of kicking around different ideas, I forget what I called them first, but it was some kind of silly filler word. And so I went and tried to find something that sounds right. And because I knew it was something that was going to be used often, it had to be something that looks weird and alien, but you can kind of figure out what it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah.
And it's fun to say out loud.
Yeah. Oh man. In the back of my head, the entire time I've been reading this series, I'm like, it's definitely a reference to John Cougar Mellencamp.
I love it.
I thought you were just poking fun at him in some crude way, but oh man. Because throughout your entire series, music is a very underlying current, whether it's from the get-go, the relationship between Detective Carter and Ajax is kind of predicated on the fact that Ajax loves disco and Detective Carter does not care for disco. So I just thought, oh, maybe this is a Mellencamp reference. Well, it's canon now, so I'm happy about that. Well, speaking of the music, actually, I wanted to dig into that a little bit. Because from the beginning of Titanshade, you do have a lot of musical reference in terms of what's on the radio, what Detective Carter is playing on vinyl at his home, and then moving forward to Titan Song. One of the key through lines of that novel is a music festival. So what is sort of your relationship to music, and how does it infuse itself into the series?
Well, I love music, but I'm not a musician at all. And as a result, thinking about music is almost like thinking about magic to me. Like, I do not speak that language. So when I hear stuff come together, it's totally over my head. Like if I read a really great book, I can read it and say like, oh, I see how this is put together and I see how it works. I may not be as good of a writer as this person, but I can work towards that. I can aspire to do that.
Yep.
But like if I hear someone play Mary Had a Little Lamb on a piano, I'm like, I could never do that. That's incredible. That's magic. So for me, it was talking about something that is totally foreign to me, and it's fun. I just got to dive into something that isn't my native language in a lot of ways. But I love music and I love listening to it. And I grew up, I'm the youngest of 8. So I had all my older brothers and sisters who listened to music ahead of me. So I grew up with a ton of different type of genres and musical styles. So I always had an appreciation for a wide range of music, and I really wanted to kind of drag that concept in and really sort of lean into it. I have. I don't know if you've seen the Spotify playlists.
No, I haven't. I didn't know there
books.
were.
Yeah, I'll have to send it to you, but I do a
Please.
Spotify playlist for each book, so you can kind of get a feel for
Oh, perfect.
the different kind of vibes.
Well, for you personally, are you more of an Ajax disco fan or a Carter rock and roll?
I am both. I actually love all of it, and I kind of grew up on classic rock from my older brothers and sisters. So I had like Steppenwolf on vinyl and Led Zeppelin on vinyl and Pink Floyd and Deep Purple and all this kind of stuff. But I also had Donna Summers and the Bee Gees and all this sort of stuff. So I probably leaned more towards classic rock, but I really grew to appreciate dance music later.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I really like is the fact that, when disco kind of ran through the Detroit sound in the 90s, that's kind of when that house and
techno scene sort of developed.
Yeah, that's when it like really picked up. And that's why somebody like Giorgio Moroder, who's like a huge name in disco and a huge name in techno, kind of spans all these decades, and that big overwhelming wall of sound. Just that sort of stuff is really interesting to me too.
No, but I think it's a cool element to add to it. And once again, I think if this series is reflective of anything, it's that you as a writer appreciate contrasts in order to evoke something about whichever side that you want to heighten, let's say. And I think this interplay between disco and rock throughout the series is a very fun reflection of the sort of personality types of Ajax versus Detective Carter, how they approach police work and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think in the third book that really culminates in a beautiful way, in the sense that I think what's the name of the disco queen in the third book?
Donna McIntyre.
Yeah, Donna McIntyre. And I think in my head immediately I was like, that's Donna Summers kind of vibe, just this immense diva. And I think the way that you portray these different elements of the music scene. Yeah, I used to be a music journalist, so I went to a lot of music festivals, spent a lot of time backstage, interviewed artists, and you really nailed this sort of feeling of the pomp and glamour of the stage and the sort of often sort of like grungy and not so nice backstage hallways and weird places that you find, especially at a music festival.
Yes. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. That is that kind of contrast, because on the stage it is so glamorous and you just step behind that stage and it's totally a different world.
Yeah. And I think one of these really nice details you had in the third book, because I can't even remember the amount of times that I would be at a concert, enjoy the concert, and then afterwards would usually be the time to interview an artist, either before or afterwards, depending on the show. But there were times where the lights would come on at a venue and you would just see this layer of stickiness on the floor. And it's just this hellscape of aftermath of what this concert was. And it's like you had this really nice detail in the third book where the festival was over and they were cleaning up and you just see like the remnants scattered around this oil rig. And I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, for sure. The sticky floors of the clubs and like just how gross they are.
Yep.
And I mean, even things like they'll have these really decorative like faux stone wraparounds on the stage or something to look like really metal, and they're just styrofoam.
Exactly.
You see them from the back, and they're not even painted all the way around and stuff. So,
oh man,
great. I love that stuff.
Yeah, but that's just another testament to you. I mean, your sort of detail oriented nature and just those little elements that you place in there that bring you into it and make you think like, oh, there's disco in this world. A music festival functions in the same way that it would in our world. But then there are just these little details that bring you in a little bit closer and then completely mixed up with all the strangeness around.
Yeah, I think too, like, Carter is kind of that classic rock and Jax is disco. And I think the city itself is funk, like a real grungy funk, like the Heavy or something. And like having the fact, like trying to keep that in mind it helps that contrast. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
I mean, it's the middle ground, and this is actually a perfect transition because I wanted to ask you about Titanshade as a sort of setting.
Yeah.
To me, it kind of evokes 70s, 80s, New York, Detroit. For sure, it has this Motor City vibe to it, especially with the amount of factory workers or oil rig workers and things like that. How did you go about pulling influences into the city? And then what did you do consciously or unconsciously in order to make Titanshade feel like it had its own character and personality?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely kind of channeling New York, Chicago, Detroit, sort of the bigger cities that I know, especially cities that have a kind of blue collar edge to them. I grew up in Toledo, which is close to Detroit. It's not a suburb of Detroit or anything, but it's kind of a blue collar town in Ohio. And Toledo is far, far smaller than Titanshade, but it's a little bit of that attitude kind of blown up real big. And just the idea of taking a city that's kind of should be big and sprawling and just compressing it so that that pressure cooker turns way up, because it's
exactly.
And the square footage, it's just this little postage stamp of warmth in the Arctic where everybody can go and try to make money. That really lent itself to that feel.
And then you have the blue collar kind of mixed with the white collar, which is immediately reflected in the actual warmth that people have access to, which I think was a cool detail to think like this neighborhood is warmer because it's physically closer to the geothermal vents that heat the city.
Yeah, absolutely. So real estate becomes precious, not only because there's not much of it, but because the locale directly is impacted. A big thing that I wanted to talk about in the books was when I read a lot of fantasy, I tended to see like nobility and people who are like living in the gutter in absolute destitute poverty. And usually one of these people turns out to be a noble. So they kind of skip over from one level to the other.
It's like your father was actually a nobleman.
Yeah.
This little orphan boy rises up to nobility.
The birthmark that you have is, it's always something like that. And those are totally fun stories, and I'm not knocking them. I love them, right? But I always thought about what people who were just getting by in these worlds, what their life is like. So they're just the people they're just trying to pay their rent, right? There's like wizards and explosions and like gods falling from the sky. And they're like, man, I need to cover my cable bill and I need to cover my rent.
Yep.
And like, I got shorted in my hours this week at work. So what am I going to do?
Yeah.
Like that concern and that idea of like, I just got to take care of me and mine is really interesting to me. And it's something I don't think gets explored a lot in a fantasy setting.
I would say even in science fiction, just in a lot of genres, there's whenever class distinctions kind of come up as a thematic element, you have these different strata. And like you say, in fantasy, you might have the nobility and the peasantry or whatever. In science fiction, you also have that. You sort of have like the if you're looking at cyberpunk, for instance, you have the corporations, and then down below that you have the street slum, street rats and thieves and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's really interesting that you're wanting to straddle the middle ground and sort of think like, okay, as general readers of science fiction and fantasy, the majority of us are probably middle class. And the majority of us are probably used to what it's like to live that life of, I got a job, I just want to look out for me and mine. I want to get my paycheck, pay my rent, that kind of thing. And I think you have a good spread of characters throughout the different strata, and that creates a much more realistic, living, breathing city in Titanshade.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's something I was very much going for. And there's plenty of people who are rich and powerful in the books.
Yeah.
partly because they make great villains, you know?
Yes, of course.
But just being able to kind of address that. The people in the middle class a lot of times are people we spend these brief little interludes with that I think are some of the more memorable parts. So they're sort of the people they're not the main focus of the story, but they're really interesting studies and interesting vignettes that give a lot of insight into the city and into the character of Carter and Ajax as they interact with them.
Yeah, I mean, they're complementary elements that give that believability factor to the city itself. And I think that's why it kind of clicked in my head of this sort of Detroit vibe. Or I grew up in Canada and British Columbia, and there's a lot of small towns. And then you go over to Alberta and even more small towns that are sort of built up around oil derricks and things like that. And you just get this feeling of working class living, and it seeps into every aspect of the city. And I think in Titanshade, it comes across really well, and that you have Detective Carter, who's somebody who has grown up in the city, and then Ajax, who's a newcomer. So you sort of have, once again, these contrasts of perspective of this is Carter's Titanshade and this is Ajax's Titanshade, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good way to put it. And neither one of those Titanshades are invalid, right? They're both that person's experience.
Yep.
And that's kind of the trick as the writer, is to keep that in mind. Like, neither one of them is right about the city, because they're both experiencing it from their own viewpoints.
Exactly. It's just like we talked about with books. Every reader has their distinctive experience reading a book, but that's their experience, and it's not incorrect in any way, shape, or form, because it's theirs and it's how they interpreted something that they consumed. And in the sense of a city, once again, that's something that we consume in our daily lives through our eyes and ears and the food that we eat and the things that we touch. And that creates a very unique perception of that city. And so for Carter, he's influenced by his mother, who is also a cop, and then he's influenced by the fact that he's a police officer. He grew up and he sort of understands the ins and outs. Ajax, who's a different race, people view him differently because he's got mandibles, and his perspective of Titanshade is more virgin, but then he's seeing it through fresh eyes as opposed to more jaded eyes, per se. Yeah, I think that was just a very nice touch on top of everything. And I think this is one of the reasons why I really like the series so much, is because Detective Carter in and of himself is a really good protagonist, but then on top of that, Titanshade is a very good city and a good setting, and something that works as a good foil for the different storylines that you present in each novel.
Nice. Yeah, thank you very much, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. And speaking of that, I wanted to sort of draw things to a close and ask you more or less what the future holds for this series, and then what you've got planned as a writer going ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, I wrote these 3 books, and I got 3 books out in 3 years. And I'm so proud of that. And I had to kind of step away, because it's like I was bent over my workbench for so long in one position. I just had to kind of step back and stretch out my muscles in the other direction. Yeah. So I've been going out and I've been working on all kinds of different genres and doing short stories, and doing up, I did some interactive fiction and just really fun things that were a totally different change. And so kind of doing a palate cleanser and moving forward. I'm definitely going to do a book 4 in one format or another. I don't have a release date on that yet, because I don't want to push it. I want to take my time and do it right. And I have a couple other projects coming out, but I can't really say too much about it. I will definitely be spreading the word when I can start making announcements and things like that.
I won't push you for any information. Don't worry.
Yeah, I know. I would always hear podcasts with people who would say, like, I can't talk about what I'm doing right now. And
yeah,
seriously, like, we're not allowed to talk about what I'm doing.
We'll say it off air. Don't worry. But that for me makes me feel very confident in like what you're going to put out in the future, because I feel like these books, the third book definitely ends in such a way where the world opens up. There's a lot of possibility for where the series can go. But I think you obviously have spent so much time delving into this world and putting out very consistent books for the last 3 years that I think you deserve the time to let it breathe and allow the continuation of the Carter archives to sort of develop naturally. And I know for sure whatever comes out from that is going to be awesome. The ending for sure has me aching for more, but I'm always of the ilk that I prefer an author to take the time with a project and put out something that is of good quality, that they're proud of, and that a reader can open up and enjoy, as opposed to put the pressure on, where the hell's your next book? Get writing, you lazy bastard.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I try to end these books in ways that make them feel satisfying, even if there's still plot elements going on and that bigger world is still ongoing.
Yep.
Because you never know what's going to happen or what outside of your control is going to happen. So I always try to make them feel like, yep, that could end there. Mm-hmm. But I know I've got at least one more in me, and then I've got a couple small things in the greater world kind of planned out and plotted out. So those would be fun to bring to life.
Well, that has me curious too. I'd be interested to see where the Mullen Campy come from, or just to see other countries and other cities within that world. Because you flesh it out in a really nice way where it's not necessarily in your face, but little mentions here and there. Oh, this city, this country, the interregional politics that are going on in this world. And yeah, I would kind of love to see what goes on outside of Titanshade. To once again contrast with this very unique city in a very desolate wasteland within this greater world.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely ideas about that. And there's a couple of the other city states that have been mentioned, and you kind of get a feel for, are they industrial, or are they governmental, or white collar, blue collar, that kind of thing. So,
are they pretentious and upper class? Oh man. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm excited for what you've got coming, but take your time, please. Don't rush it. And then just to close out, I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh, what am I reading right now? I am reading Ash and Brimstone by Megan Sparks, who is a member of my debut author class. And I just picked it up. It is kind of like a paranormal romance, fantasy, angels, devils,
very cool
craziness. I'm really digging it. It opens up with a really brutal fight, so I always like that.
That's always a good way to start a book.
Yeah, it's amazing, because once I was published, all of a sudden I had all these peers who were supporting me, and we're all swapping books and telling each other stories. And there were, just in our small group that we were communicating with, there were over 200 of us.
Oh, wow.
Who had debuts published that year, not just, not even counting all the other books that came out.
That's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy. And I have a reading list now that's going to last me years, just from that one group from 2019. So
that's perfect.
So I just read that. And what else did I just read? I finished reading the East of West graphic novels.
Oh, really nice.
Fantastic. I love weird Westerns, and I love, talking about like blending genres and stuff, blending Western and sci-fi and apocalyptic fiction. Really fantastic stuff.
And I think it's good that I do the same thing where I sort of mix, first of all, genres in order to not bore myself or to get too tired of any one genre, but also to mix mediums. So I'll kind of mix it up between graphic novels, and then a little bit of nonfiction thrown in here and there just to spice things up. But I think it's good that you're delving into graphic novels too, because as a writer, do you feel like you have a lot of inspiration to pull from graphic novels in terms of this is how they intersperse visual versus textual information.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was self-publishing comics back in the '90s during the black and white boom, and I worked for a really successful self-publisher, so I got to see like how he did these books and how the company worked and how people responded to it, and it was just amazing to be 20 and seeing all this stuff come together. And I worked at the Columbus or still has a cartoon and graphic arts library. It's called the Billy Ireland Library now.
Oh man.
So
just for comics and graphic arts.
Yeah, graphic arts, but like the Winsor McKay, like the like Gertie the Dinosaur, the first animated short. Like I've held some of those original. They're not cells; they're actually on like Bristol board.
Wow.
Each one of them hand illustrated, just big old like gorgeous newspaper strips. Just yeah, it's an amazing resource, and I'm just absolutely soaked in that tradition. I love it.
Man, I'm so jealous that you have that close by to you.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
Like a couple of years ago, I went to Japan with my wife, and in Tokyo, we had the opportunity to go to a manga museum. Mm-hmm. And just the fact that there's like entire place dedicated to this beautiful art form makes me so happy that there are people that appreciate that, but also that there are people who want to preserve the history of that kind of thing. Because I feel like we, as readers and writers, we owe a lot to genres like graphic novels and manga and things like that. And this cross-cultural dissemination of different art forms and different ways of storytelling.
Yeah. And, there's something to be said when you're looking at like an original Walt Kelly Pogo strip or something like that. Number one, the craftsmanship is amazing. Mm-hmm. But the other thing is you see where they screwed up. Yep. You see where they scratched it out and covered it up with white paint and fixed it. And understanding that these people who are brilliant artists and brilliant storytellers screwed it up and had to go back in and try again, and took the time to do it. Took the time to go back in and fix it. It was really educational.
Well, I think that's the perfect way to end this. All successes come from small failures, and I think that's a beautiful sentiment to end on. Dan, thank you so much for taking the time, and I appreciate you talking to me. And
thank you, man. This was totally fun. I loved it.
Yeah, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Yeah.
Whenever your next book comes out, doesn't matter what it is, we'll chat.
You got it.
All right, man. Thank you so much.